Kyle Thompson.
And I'm Eric Meier.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time it is just myself without June hosting. And this time we are discussing Eric's exhibition, Art, Design, Aesthetics of Democratic Economic Planning. Eric, I know you from the GIU community and also from the Anticipate community from my work. But can you just provide a little background on yourself and how you came to do this art exhibition?
Yes, of course. Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm Eric Meier. I live in Bonn, Germany, and just a bit south of Cologne. And I'm studying sociology and philosophy for a pretty long time now, but I've been doing a lot of other stuff like political work, political organizing work on the side for quite some time too. And I think around this spring, I got I don't know how to formulate it, but I can say I kind of got into art, so to say it, because basically I grew up in a very small town, and I kind of grew up with the idea of, okay, art is something for elitist old people. And whenever I visited a museum or something like that, like an art museum, I felt bodily uncomfortable, as if okay, this space, this I am not my entire existence is not welcome here. I'm like a bacterium or something, like an alien being in this body of this institution or something. And so then some stuff happened in the spring, and I started a little bit of my own personal journey, so to say, of okay, hey, what is this thing? And also started to realize, hey, I've kind of always been into this. I just never called it art. And others never called it art. Maybe you could just call it it's aesthetics. It's the aesthetics of stuff, basically. you can call it like that. And
and so that brought you to examining the aesthetics of democratic economic planning, right?
It's a little bit more complicated. Basically, I feel nobody has done that. Basically, this exhibition, I feel, is kind of a first of its kind, and which also made it quite difficult, I think. But of course, with the reflection process of that I started to enter, what kind of art scare quote we will leave the scare quotes away for practical reasons. I don't want to say art scare quotes stuff all the time. I started, okay, what kind of art do I like? And of course, with the political, I basically do a lot of networking work and political organizing work in this space around new democratically planned economy models and stuff that's connected to that. And as we talked before, listening to GIU since 2018, GIU's second strongest soldier, and of course the question of the relation of art and politics, and this specifically popped up immediately. And I think the point came where, okay, in around June or July this year, there was a huge publication wave in German, big mainstream newspapers. And those aren't leftist. They are not leftist at all. Sometimes they are pretty conservative. And I think around I don't have the exact number in my head right now, but like 4 to 5 articles in a time span of 1 month came out about or super closely related to the idea of like economic planning. And of course, it was also the time where like Evgeny Morozov's the Santiago Boys podcast came out. But I mean, it's like, of course, it's like super tightly related to that. And so there was also like some buzz around that. And I basically saw like how every normal human being sees like an article, the title, and like the header picture, like the picture. And let's say 95% of people who see this don't read anything more. Like even if you like share something on social media, it's like you have the header picture and the title, and that's it. Like, and so those are the two most important elements of that. And like, first of all, this whole publishing wave like super overwhelmed me. I was like, okay, what is going on here? I didn't knew we were this far already into the plan of like pushing this idea into the public, so to say.
Sure,
Like,
sure.
I was like, we are not ready for this. We haven't like we don't even know how to push these ideas into the public, and like we need to kind of like catch up to where we like to the opportunities we or at least like in Germany apparently have in this regard. And I looked at the header pictures and I was like, okay, this is disappointing, to stay polite. Yeah, and it was either like super abstract stuff that I can't even describe, or it was like pictures basically of like GDR or in the case of like the Santiago Boys, like articles about the Santiago Boys, like something with Allende or like the chairs or something, and I was like, okay, we want this idea to push out as like an idea for our future. Nobody associates anything that's like desirable or like, oh, this is our future or this is our potential future with these pictures. Like nobody.
Right. I mean, you know, there's a kind of curiosity to the CyberSyn room that's, you know, artifact of that time in Chile, but it isn't something that feels contemporaneous with us. It feels something from its time, right?
Exactly. Like basically I then reflected and was like, okay, what are the aesthetics that we like intuitively associate with like the planning idea? And even when you look to like people who are active in this sphere, like when they publish articles like on blogs or wherever, when they have like some kind of visuals associated, what is like their what are they using? It's either some kind of like Soviet aesthetic, like with like mixed with computers in it, or you have CyberSyn, or you have what was the other one? The like Walmart book inspired one, like server rooms, like basically big computer will solve the economy. Amazon and Walmart, but make it socialist.
Right. Sure.
And none of those are like really like basically I think and I'm super convinced about this, the public fight about political ideas and ideas about the future is like fought on like the associational level, like what kind of associations, emotional idea, whatever do we have with certain ideas, and images play like this key role there. Like for example, if you say degrowth, what kind of images, what kind of ideas pop up in your mind? And at least partially it is this like, oh, scaling down of the economy, everything is just like small town rural stuff. And even I mean like, okay, parts and a certain like few people who like advocate for degrowth like like do say, oh, this is what we need to do, but like that's not degrowth in its entirety. It's just like this very particular image that has manifested itself, and that's super difficult to get out of people's heads. And so once an image is like sedimented, is like set in, it's super hard to like get rid of this image. So like taking like basically identifying this like early operating space for, okay, you still have kind of time to forge the images and associations for that idea is super critical. And so I was like, okay, all of the aesthetics that we have are basically useless. Like, nobody wants the old Soviet aesthetics except like a few nerds, basically. And the cybersyn aesthetics is like, it's kind of interesting, but it's also, oh, it's retro, it's 50 years ago. It's also this like, oh, those stupid leftists holding on to like their failures and like being super melancholic. Like it also like has these associations, I feel like.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like it's sort of evocative and suggestive of something else, but it isn't. It feels like, you know, a place you can start working from aesthetically, but you can't really stay in that space for all those reasons you described. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this, oh, at this specific point in history, there once was this opportunity to build something different. And it's like this holding on to this like unique historical moment of possibility, but we are not in this moment anymore. It's like right. Very melancholic, very, and like it doesn't have a future direction. And I mean, the Amazon or Walmart, but make it socialist. I mean, it might also be intriguing and provocative and interesting to a certain degree, but it's like as soon as you like it brings up all of these associations of like, okay, you combine it with like, oh, totalitarianism, big data, surveillance, and people will scream and just think, okay, yeah, socialism, yeah, okay, total surveillance, totalitarianism, yeah. Like, it just amplifies all of the stuff that we fear and don't like about these like companies and super conglomerates into oblivion, basically. And so that's also nothing that we can really build on. And I was like, okay, hey, we really need to strategically think about this, because this is not just an art thing that you can like, hey, you do this for funsies, but this is a strategic question, like literally. And especially because like, okay, so many people who work in this regard are academics or like very academically socialized. They think in terms of abstract models of papers. They don't think visually. And yeah, like maybe diagrams. Diagrams are an interesting thing, but it's like, because it's kind of like in the communicative dynamics that they institutionally like have internalized and inhabit all the time, they don't really think about these things, or like at least not enough. Because you don't find any work online that really is like, oh, look, we need to think about this. Here are some interesting thoughts about this. Like you just don't find anything. And
yeah, I mean, I think you can obviously get like scholars of aesthetics, and maybe they will collaborate with artists, but I really wouldn't expect anything groundbreaking in terms of visual language or visual aesthetic of this whole dimension of democratic economic planning to come out of academia, for sure. Like it's, you know, there might be theory behind it, but it won't be the actual working out of the visual language.
Exactly. And so basically I came up with like the problem I identified the problem first and was like, okay, so what could be alternatives? What kind of aesthetic should we use? And then I realized, okay, before I can answer that, or before we, because it's a shared problem, before we can answer that, I identified the problem. It's like a shared problem. Before we can answer that, I think we have to go through like so many steps of like methodological questions, that like I will come back to a few of them, but I was like, okay, so how do I get people to engage with these questions? And of course, I could have like written like a blog post, an article, or something. Maybe one person, two people read that, don't talk about it, and forget about it, and that's that. Um, and so I was like, okay, how do you get this to be discussed? And then I was okay. You need to make this a social thing. You need to get people together, and at the location already start to discuss about that. And because then, okay, like the first step is being done, it's much easier to follow up. That stuff stays in people's heads, and they really start to work through that stuff. And so I came up with this, hey, like really kind of like at the beginning it was just a childish fantasy of like, hey, what if I could do this exhibition thing where like, oh, you also have like a talk and like workshops or something and bring all of these people together. And yeah, and the idea was that that with the works that I would display, like I wouldn't ask these questions that I thought about, all of these like methodological questions. I wouldn't just straight up put them out there and ask people that, but work from the other way around. Like basically already exhibit a work that is, or that is kind of like a provocation because it already gives an answer. And then people will like come up with critique, will come up with points of like, oh, I don't like this about that, I don't like this about that. And what I wanted is basically that through that process, that they automatically kind of like almost accidentally reverse engineer the kind of questions that I would have been asking anyway, and also like come up with alternative questions to these answers, because I think that is much more engaging and like also shows like, oh, there's relevancy for the people involved, rather than just give them the question and they have never thought about the question, and so they don't know about an answer, and then it like completely goes out of their head again and they never think about it. But like I wanted to do this.
Yeah, in some of my own research, academic research, I was studying about public reflections on video games, and one thing that came out, I did a content analysis, and one thing that came out of that was very clear was that when people talk about art, well, in this case, about video games, they primarily talk about the the most tangible elements of the art. So the things that appear as objects in a sensory way, and so you can talk conceptually around those objects, but the objects are still sort of the subject matter of the conversation to a large degree. And if there are abstract conversations, they tend to be a lot shorter than the conversations about these tangible things, because people like sharing experiences and having sort of things in their mind's eye that are common amongst each other. At least that's my thought about it, of why this is happening. So, yeah, I think it makes sense to, I can see in front of me the YouTube video that you have of the exhibition, and I can see there are all these different pictures you've included on this wall, and using those as your, as you say, answers to provide provocations to get people talking and discussing, I think is a good way to go.
Like basically for everyone, check out the video in the show notes. Basically what I did is like give like a little bit of like a tiny talk about the context of the exhibition, give an overview, and at the end, every work that I exhibited is displayed in detail in like high resolution, and the text commentary is there, so you just have to press pause and can take all the time you want to look at pictures and read text and everything. Do it.
So you can if you're listening to this podcast and you feel like, oh, I don't want to listen to the whole background again, you can skip to the end and see the images individually. But it's also useful to, I think, see the pan from one side to another, at least, to see, how they're arranged together.
Yeah, maybe I can talk about the arrangement. Basically, there were like three sections of the exhibition. The first was kind of like a taking stock part, so to say. So like, okay, what are the already existing aesthetics? Not like mostly focused on democratic economic planning, but I also included like stuff on solar punk, like the screenshot from this super famous Chobani ad in the Studio Ghibli style, and I also included it was like a 3D architecture render for like a sustainable neighborhood apartment complex thing in China by like I think Guyar Architects were their name, like a Spanish architect studio, and so also stuff that's like indirectly related to ideas of, okay, utopian aesthetics and like contemporary utopian aesthetics and how do we think about the future, and but yeah, there's also straight up just graphs of models of like very famous planning models. Yeah, and it's kind of like the taking stock part. Then the middle part is stuff by other people, well, partially commissioned. So basically, I approached people and said, "Hey, I really like your style of art. I have this proposal for you. I want to do this exhibition about this idea." And they also didn't have to be acquainted with the idea, with the discourse in any kind of way. I said, okay, hey, if you want, I can send you one or two articles or videos to get like a rough idea of this, and then basically let them loose and say, hey, put all kinds of associations that you have with this idea that just pop up in your mind, in your belly, like emotional, whatever, and like compress them into a picture. And because I think that's also super important, like not just, oh, what are the associations for people who are already super familiar with that. Their associations are going to be like obviously very different from like just some random people. And so I got, and like that was kind of like half of that basically, and the other half was just pre-existing work that I, to a certain extent, connected aesthetically, even if it's like on a more abstract level, with this idea, and also wrote like text commentary for a good chunk of them, and I just asked the people, hey, can I exhibit this? And yeah, they were go off king. And yeah, and the third part is four of my own works, which are like the most, I think, like out there, the most experimental, and the most personal ones.
Right.
And
Yes.
yeah, it's kind of like the structure. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have the selection of existing resources, these original works by other artists, and then or ones that you thought were relevant by other artists, and finally your own work at the end. One thing, so it's very eclectic, looking at the different images you have exhibited, right? So there are many different art styles, many different subject matters, and I guess we maybe should talk first about the art pieces that were by other artists that you brought in, since that's kind of second in the order. Does that track?
Yeah, we can do so. Also, let me like just give a short shout out on the artists that were exhibited. Like just like a super short list. Those are like where I knew, okay, this is from those people. That's Rafael Ara, Art Jan Venema, Giacomo Bettiol, Miyugumi, Duamur, Choco, Kamaji, Rain Mikes, who I also did in collaboration with him the promo poster for the exhibition, Julia Witte Zimmerman, Poverty FL, and yeah, and myself in the end. And like just some name drops in here. That's the most important thing, first of all.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so in terms of what is in the accompanying video, I think the first artwork by a different artist is the further work. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. Like I think basically it's the one by Giacomo Bettiol. Oh no, that's not the. No, you're right. You're right. The one by Giacomo Bettiol, which is the Santiago Boys cover art, so to say, is still like the stock taking section. You're right. You're right.
Yes, from the podcast. That's the cover art of the podcast.
Yes, exactly. I emailed the Santiago Boys team and got like an answer by Evgeny Morozov himself, and he was like, "Yeah, that's the name of the artist. Sounds cool. Exhibited. Here's the file." Like it was very uncomplicated. It was super cool.
Great, awesome, that's fantastic. Yeah, so I mean that piece, I suppose, as we were saying, it's exactly as you describe, right? Like it's scenes from Cybersyn, the control room there. We have a sort of imaginary scene where Allende, Flores, and Beer are all sitting down in this control room. But then we also have some other images, which is like the Soviet Union, like the map of the Soviet Union with on a globe. We have the tanks during the coup, right? That overthrew Allende. That's another image there, and then finally we have a sort of social realist Soviet propaganda poster style thing where it's a few workers with a red flag and a hammer and wrench on the flag in the background, but very much that social realist imagery, even if it isn't actually a copy of a Soviet poster.
Exactly. Yeah, I like. I wanted to have this included because it's like because the Santiago Boys podcast made like so much buzz. Like I followed the press releases and stuff, and I was like, "Holy moly, this is like going wild!" And I like
yeah, it's quite impressive.
Yeah. Also, like I love the podcast. Like the production quality is amazing, and I feel it's like its greatest strength. It's the same as with the film How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Their greatest strength is that they are also just entertaining. They're just fun to like watch or listen to, even if you're politically completely like not interested in them. Like it's just exciting. Like it's like a thriller basically.
It's a good story. Yeah.
Exactly, and yeah. So basically, these two actually, like the How to Blow Up a Pipeline film that I watched earlier this year, and the Cybersyn podcast. Like I look up to these as like two of like the biggest media products that the democratic economic planning sphere kind of like put out there in the last year, and I was like that are really heavy hitters. in terms of like, okay, strategic idea dissemination. And especially if you look at kind of like all of the resources, all of the background work that's necessary to make these things happen and possible, is like huge. And I always look at that and I'm like super impressed, have the highest respect for this, and also need to remind myself, because like we're so frustrated in our own political work like all the time, and have to remind myself, okay, this is possible. Like getting a project like this off of the ground is possible. And it's like a indirect role model, so to say, like as a big inspiration. And that's why it's like so representative of like this. It's kind of like a, how you call that, the card with the name, or the business. It's kind of business card. Like it's a public business card for the planning sphere that like people associate with, and it's like, okay, this is, and that's why I wanted to have it included, basically. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good representative image and you know, summation of sort of the associated aesthetics that people think about with the subject matter. The next image now, is this the Bentham's Nightmare image?
Yes, that's by Duamur, who's also a producer, like who does like synthwave, vaporwave influenced stuff, but very cool stuff. And I also played some of his music at the closing event, and he also actually visited the exhibition, so we like met there for the first time, which was super cool. And he also wrote a short story, Bentham's Nightmare, and this short story is like amazing. Like I love it. Like everyone who's listening to this and is ready and willing to click on the video, go to the video, just click at the end and search for Bentham's Nightmare and only read the short story. Like it's worth alone only for that. Like I love that. Seriously.
Yes, for sure. And so the image is very much in the Y2K aesthetic, which I think is something that shows up a lot in this exhibition. Now, the Y2K aesthetic, for people who aren't like super familiar with it, is essentially about lots of organic lines, computer generated imagery, lots of bright white light and clean like synthetic surfaces like glasses, and also plastics are really prominent, and this was kind of a flash in the pan aesthetic that was very was massively popular around the year 2000, and sort of died following 9/11.
I didn't knew that. That's fun. That's like interesting.
Yeah.
Is it so correlated with that event? 9/11 killed Y2K.
Yeah, no, like for sure. Like you have the .com bubble, right? That happens, and then you also have 9/11. And I feel like those are the two events that really put it in the ground. But yeah, it's an aesthetic that comes out of industrial design, in terms of designing consumer products, like electronic consumer products, right? Like MP3 players, CD players, lots of different media devices, but also furniture. There was a whole design movement at this time that was taking advantage of the new possibilities that existed in design because of like computer modeling, and also just this sense of like liquid flow, organic, as an idea of the future that went along with all the millennial sort of thinking around the year 2000. And you're probably also very familiar with it from music videos of the time, Right. That's one of the most significant ones. Like Hype Williams is he's a director. His music videos from that era are like very emblematic of this aesthetic.
Like I actually came across it, and it's like popping up again at the moment. I mean, it's like interesting because you have this like, okay, hey, like it was super futuristic back then, and now it's like retro futurism, and I like. Do you see it super much like popping up in fashion at the moment again, and like yeah, also fashion design. And isn't it like basically between like the Memphis era and before the Frutiger era in like the design kind of like UI UX kind of like design paradigms?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So it definitely had a whole UI UX dimension you could find in like software appearance. Winamp was like Winamp skins for the music player. There was tons of this kind of design for that. There was in video games, you had a lot of like menu screens that followed
Oh
this
yeah, yeah,
organic
yeah.
aesthetic. It was really common. It was a very dominant aesthetic paradigm at the moment it came out. And as you said, in clothing as well, right? Lots of stuff with sportswear, tons of sportswear, tons of reflective materials,
Oh yeah.
very associated with raving and like electronic music. And yeah, as you say, it's come back as an aesthetic right now because it's on a 20-year cycle, like everything. So it's been recycled at this moment as a retro futurist thing because it's been about 20 years since it was in its heyday. And of course this aesthetic, although it did rely on a lot of new aesthetic possibilities from like materials and computer design, it also was very influenced by sort of like the postmodern philosophy of the moment in terms of thinking about everything as flowing, this like global community of economic and cultural flows. It still was drawing on like 70s aesthetics, such as the Cybersyn room, right? You can see that flowing line in the Cybersyn room on those chairs has a family resemblance to what you see in Y2K. It's just more extreme in Y2K, right? So there is that historical recurrence of returning to previous ideas, but this was something quite new as well.
Yeah, like I think like with regards to like new technological possibilities, maybe I mean like of course it's like in with as you said like 20-year cycle things are coming back into fashion, but also because people now have like the possibility of just using like Blender at the like with like high like super powered graphics cards like using Blender at the home PC, basically like doing all of this modeling and editing stuff just as like private people. And like 10 years ago you didn't have that really, like that was like it wasn't as common. And uh so yeah, I also want to say like the whole why are we talking about that, I think like we're with the kind of like the philosophy that you said, like the philosophy, like the main associations with like it's not like, oh, people see Y2K aesthetics and think like Lyotard. It's rather this like what you said, like this like, okay, technology has like transgressed all boundaries and made them unnecessary, and everything we are just going to do, we are just going to become these like floaty beings or something. And like these like very, let's say, like amateurish first associations. And like I always think it's like also like UX, UI design, or like design in general. It's like it always presents you with like an outlook on the world. Like it always is like presents you with like, this is what you are in relation to the world. Like always like, okay, like gives you, you are a subject, and what does it mean to be a subject in this world? What's your relation to that, kind of? And I think like right now is kind of, there has been this trend of like re-examining Fruitiger Arrow, like the thing that came after Y2K, around like early, like let's say like mid 2000s, late 2000s until like the mid 2010s. Like think starting with Windows Vista, basically. This like the main colors are blue and green, and like literally just think Windows Vista, water and bubbles, and uh, and at the moment there is this thing going on, like coming, like basically looking back at that time and being like, wow, it was this whole paradigm that was everywhere, and it now has kind of like vanished almost universally in favor of like flat design corporate Memphis kind of stuff. And like corporate Memphis is this specific art style that like think big tech, how big tech companies nowadays represent people. It's like in this cartoonish style, like not even real humans, not even real skin colors. They have like purple skin or something, and bizarre, often bizarre proportions. And that's kind of like, that's what you call corporate Memphis. It's very dominant at the moment. And yeah, so there's like, it's of course also connected with like nostalgia, because that was the time basically where there was this dream of like, oh, social media is going to connect us all, and like free flowing information is going to bring democracy over the whole world, and we're all going to be connected. Like that, breaking it super down, that was kind of like the outlook, and it's just nobody believes that anymore. You cannot tell that anyone and anyone will believe it anymore. So people are looking like nostalgically back to when promises still meant something. And I find that very interesting. Like the one a little bit more to the right, which is this. So there is this one, the graph one, within those Fruitiger Arrow aesthetics by Partial or 429 Skin, who I forgot to shout out earlier. I'm super sorry about that. It doesn't have a title, but it basically mixes this the Fruitiger Arrow aesthetic. Then it mixes in the graph aesthetics, which is super interesting because on the super left side, as like the first ones, we have these like very sleek, very minimalist black and white graphs of the new planning models. And here you have a completely different and that's kind of like this like super minimalist graph design is what most of us know, like as like the standard thing. Maybe here or there a little bit color, but like nothing. And you have this super stylized graph on Partial's piece, and it doesn't make any, like it isn't about anything, which is super interesting because thereby it reflects on, oh, this is a graph, and the graph can look very differently. And I mean, probably the most crazy graphs you see that like it's probably its own aesthetics are like the graphs of the Department of Defense. Like
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of admire them to a certain extent. They're very interesting. And then you have the Fruitiger Arrow stuff, which is all like twisted in this weird core aesthetic, where it's like Fruitiger Arrow, but think it's like very twisted, very over the top, very like subverting itself, basically. Yeah, that's kind of like the script, like a rough description of the Partial piece. Yeah.
Yeah, so from a distance, this one, I mean, it looks to me almost like it almost looks like some kind of like a religious symbol as opposed to a graph. But when you look at it closer up, you can see that it is in fact a graph, and accompanied by, yes, this very bubble like arrow design that goes with it. Yeah.
What you're saying about like graph and like it almost looks like a religious symbol, like that's super interesting because of like, okay, you have symbols like the tree of life, or like what like in kind of like in between there is like generally like schizo posting. Like schizo posting that either ironically or unironically leans into like conspiracy theory aesthetics, and there of course you have like religious symbols mixed in all over, and sometimes even the whole thing creating like like, oh my god, look, there are all these connections, and they do like a pentagram or something. And like I find schizo posting in general super interesting, like for its aesthetics quality and what it says about like the possibilities of forging semantic connections, and what we were talking about earlier with like how do you forge associations with ideas. I think schizo posting is super interesting in that regard. Like, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Definitely, because there is a sort of inherent quality to graphing things where your attempts to represent the world through these kinds of like regular shapes just become overburdened and meaningless. Like, for example, I did a social graph when I was a student at Kyoto University, and the number of nodes and connections on that graph are so huge that it's like only with somebody really guiding you through it can you get something out of it. And even then, it's probably like more of a portal to madness than anything else. Yeah.
That's super interesting because it like plays on two other pieces that I will come to like immediately. But just one last thing about schizo posting, like two huge influences on like if people can't associate anything with that word. One of my biggest influences the last year. I basically came across them just when I started reflecting upon art. Is the Shadow Wizard Money Gang. Like just search them on you and like watch their videos and stuff, and you will probably see what I mean at a certain point. It's not just schizo posting, but schizo posting is part of their stuff. And also some of James Ferraro's work, like especially the video one is it's not entirely schizo posting, but it leans into that. I feel like. Also came across James like it's all so compressed. Like this year was crazy, truly, for me. But yeah, coming to the what you meant like with the social graph and like just the huge like overload of visual data and stimulation. I also in the stock taking section have like a scan from an article by Nick Chernak. I think Nick Chernak. I still can't pronounce his name correctly. Cernicek. Oh, he's one of my like theoretical influence OGs, and I still struggle with that. Like, it's
Yeah.
keeping it real for good old times, and that when you didn't know how to pronounce his name, but yeah, it's a snippet from an article of his about interface design and the role of interfaces of mediating complex systems and agency of the individual subject. And there he speaks about like those like aesthetics of like over complexity, let's say, and also reference like an art group called I think they are pronounced Bureau d'études. They have a book out that I wanted to order actually, the Atlas of Agendas. Like basically do like mapping, like very intricate mapping of like institutions, actors. It's all kinds of connections. But basically he speaks about this. Okay, you can map like all kinds of also financial flows or whatever, but it's just this like sublime aesthetics of too much. Basically, it's too much. That also references the one piece that I have on the right side with crying Hatsune Miku, which is called Literally Me, which is basically about like too much complexity and not being able to deal with it. And but yeah, and basically there he says, okay, like Shanachek, the role of the interface is kind of like to reduce complexity and to condense just the most important parts of it that kind of like they get like downsized to our computational.
Yeah, variety attenuation, right?
Exactly, like kind of like to our computational capacity meant to, like for individual subjects. And so you can kind of actually the data starts like meaning something to you. Like you can actually relate to that and say, oh, this says this, it's meaningful, and it gives you, for example, like possible leverage points in a system. And yeah, what you said with variety attenuation, like complexity reduction, that kind of stuff. And that's why, like, you might say, like, okay, why are these people talking about interface, like UI design, UX design? What does this have to do with anything? Like, exactly, interfaces are very, very important. And you can say, like, the CyberSyn control room is, like, I mean, it's full of interfaces, and it's itself a kind of interface. And also, we might say, like, like we use interfaces all the time in our world. They are omnipresent. We don't even recognize them anymore. You might say, okay, what was weird, like kind of like the dashboardification of life, that like it's still like in the process, but like in every kind of like app or whenever like work program or something, you log on, you get a dashboard, and how that like reconfigures your relation to your tasks, your life, etc. And like that's also a thing. I don't want to give answers with this exhibition. It's just more like, hey, taking on developments, associations, fears, hopes, and dreams, and like, yeah. And also, as a last point, the interface stuff is in the first part, and at one of the at the top, there is this collage of interfaces from the video game Half of Socialism, and which is basically a game made up of interfaces. And it's also, it also count among like How to Blow Up a Pipeline, the movie, and the the Santiago Boys podcast as like one of the great achievements of like putting a public less successful as these, one probably might say, but still like an admirable achievement of like just, it's amazing. I love this game. Yeah. Everybody play the Half of Socialism game, and listen to the episode GIU did on it. Yeah.
Yes, please. Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. So we've sort of talked about the, you know, as you say, the Arrow aesthetic. We've talked about the Y2K aesthetic, and you know they're both represented here. But then we have some other aesthetics that come in here as well. There is this piece towards the end, or a triptych, I suppose, that is done in kind of a, I guess, yeah, like a sort of an iconic religious art style, and almost a sort of storybook style. There's kind of like this picture of a demon and somebody
it's the Grim Reaper. It's the Grim Reaper.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. On the left, we have the Grim Reaper. In the middle, we have quite a scene that's going on where there's like somebody with a written text that is being like accused of something and is with a demon and a woman, is what I can see there.
No, no, no. It's yeah, no. It's like it's not. I don't think it's being accused. Like first of all, I think the triptych aesthetics like wasn't intentional, neither by the artist nor by myself. Like it's just kind of like that's kind of, but it's interesting that you interpret it this way.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, the frames on the side is inspired by tarot cards. Um, and that's why yeah, that's why the frames are there, and the spiritual kind of like undertones. And the one in the middle is a woman holding up a plan. It's actually called proposal, and there's
I
like
see
this.
that.
I th- I think it's like Wizard of Oz kind of guy inspired, like magician or something. Then it's a mermaid actually,
Oh,
and an orc, and like it's kind of like set in this fantasy universe, and they are kind of like basically it's supposed to be like, okay, hey, someone is coming up with a like basically production proposal of like a plan, and like, hey, why don't we do things this way? And I like how I interpret it is like basically they are starting to discuss about the proposal in question, and yeah, the one with the Grim Reaper is called "Failing to Plan is Planning to Fail." And then the one on the right is, I think, I don't know if a child or a woman, but she's holding the earth in her hands and like looking down on it very caringly. And the title is like for those two in because it has like it has tarot and like just overall card game inspirations. Their titles are in the artwork themselves. That one is called "To Plan is to Protect," and yeah, like basically there I wanted to like as I said, like I basically asked artists, hey, like go off with your associations, and I also wanted to break up the aesthetics of everything. I didn't want to like, oh, this is all just because it's, I mean, obviously it's very much filtered through my own personal taste, my own personal biases. Like that's very, it doesn't have this, hey, this is representative of anything, except maybe the first section. That's like the most like, yeah. But like I also wanted to break things up aesthetically, and yeah,
yeah. I mean, it is very eclectic, like stylistically, and so I think that was definitely a success in terms
and it's
of
the
saying that they, these are styles that are clearly different from each other.
exact, and it's the first one that like also actually has like actual humans depicted, like and like at least in the middle section, because all of the other like you have like two humans on like in the glitch core ones, but it's like they're distorted humans, and those are the also like okay, fantasy setting is like completely different than like all of the other stuff is much more like sci-fi inspired, so I found that very interesting too. And also the inclusion of the titles that were already kind of like slogans, and the question of like, okay, could you use these slogans, like for example in pushing this idea to the public, like when people think about like planning, that they associate that like this kind of slogan comes up in their head already, and like that not planning means preparing for failure basically, and like reflecting on the slogans themselves was also one of the ideas behind it, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean the middle picture kind of looks like Martin Luther with his theses, right? Like with the plan. So it's is quite interesting. Yeah, and yeah, very like you say, it's very much more figurative than all these other pieces that are use all these like really abstract flowing shapes or the very distorted ones, the glitched out ones at the bottom. And then we have on the right, we have something that I guess you might say is a bit more sort of traditional or maybe conventional, like sci-fi utopianism kind of look.
Yeah, that's also by Duamour, the same guy who did the Bantham's Nightmare, and they also, because they both blender art. So that's also why they look the way they do. Like,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Yeah, no, for sure. And so this is just kind of an island building with a number of like sort of, I don't know how you describe them, like light posts kind of things on it, or maybe.
No, it's I hope I don't I hope this is the right word, with like palms.
Yeah,
No,
palms. Yeah, palm trees.
Palm trees, exactly, and like it's called a high sea oasis, and it's basically like, at the moment we have this idea of like, oh, these like secluded islands, either metaphorically or literally, that are like retreat places for the super rich where they can live in luxury, etc., etc. And his point was basically like, he has very much this also in the Bantham's Nightmare short story and the artwork, like turning kind of like existing technological infrastructure on its head, and like, oh, what if we made like, what would it mean if we could make islands like these into like resorts for the masses, basically? What would that mean? And I had an interesting thing, like, this is the only piece I think where both me and the artist themselves wrote like a commentary, and we have it side by side. And I had a completely different commentary and a completely different interpretation of it.
I can see how the aesthetic here is sort of like reminiscent of like cruise ships.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
and in that way is like mass accessible tourism kind of idea. Yeah.
Yeah, like my interpretation was, and also this is something I'm gonna like. Also, what I want to do is I'm gonna read like two of the text commentary, like, that are pretty short, but just to give people like an impression of what kind of text commentary maybe I write or I have written, and it's gonna be like pretty short. But like for this one, it's like the idea was basically, okay, struggling with what does it mean to quote unquote build a new world, like because that is something like with the okay, who's working on the planning idea basically, and in practice this will always be a limited group of people, like, selected. And how do you, so that's also why, and people have to be like, to a certain extent at least, sheltered from everyday struggles of the outside world, so that they even have the capacity to deal with that kind of work. And I like, there I use the metaphor of like the island, and I mean, of course, the idea of, oh, at like some secluded region, an island, like the most bright young minds of our generation are there to build like the world of tomorrow or something. Like, that's also a trope in like utopian, dystopian film and literature. I love, it's like not super well known, the game. I love the opening of it's called Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Breakpoint. And when you look on YouTube, the opening video cutscene, it's so amazing. Like that kind of like really encapsulates that this kind of vibe. And I also watched like playthrough of the game, and the whole setting is like very much this. Oh, it's amazing. But so I'm basically, okay, there is this material necessity that this kind of like work, to make it more abstract, struggling for emancipation cannot immediately be a universal task. It has to start with particular actors. So it must introduce or must work upon already existing elements of inequality. And that's the material necessity. Okay, how do you deal with that necessity, like in organizational dynamics, and like how do you what do I want to say? How do you prevent it from just becoming like a semi-elitist circle that just like starts to become its own bubble, be sheltered from the outside world, and then it becomes like a dystopian thing? Um, uh, but also, how do you deal with this material necessity? You cannot just like reject that, because like that's to be organized means to put like a boundary between you and those who are not organized to some extent. Like that's everyone who has been active in any kind of organization knows that. And how do you deal with that in a responsible manner? But also, how do you deal with that emotionally, either as someone who's on the other side, like, or someone who's on the inside? Something I've been like, the emotional part is something I will come to too, because all of this, the whole exhibition, all of the themes are like also very emotionally charged for me personally. And it's I think that's also important, because like, of course, I want to ask, hey, what is the like mobilizing emotions? Because if it's just abstract ideas that we are like raising, that doesn't like make anything happen in people. It will like, oh yeah, whatever, like it doesn't connect with them. Like, no, how do you hopes, fears, and dreams, like basically how do you connect to that? And of course, also for me, like, I have been very much struggling with dealing with, in my own part, like resentment and hate, and especially towards like, okay, not towards, but like dealing with like the people who are in the planning discourse, so to say. A lot of them are like, oh, they have like some, I mean, this is somewhat sarcastically, but somewhat cushy academic jobs. And it's like a lot of, okay, hey, you internalize like selection mechanisms very much from an institutional academic bubble, and me as a networker who is kind of like between all chairs, so like I'm never fully part of anything, which is my strength and my biggest weakness at the same time. And I have the feeling I have to permanently prove myself and my worth and the worth of my work to other people, because I cannot say, hey, I'm Eric Meier, I work for this big organization. Exactly. And I mean, my main job is like being a cashier, like sitting at a cash register, like at a grocery store. Like that's my main job. And like I want to make this networking thing my job, but it's like super hard and super difficult. And like dealing with that pain, and of like, oh, you really recognize that, hey, I am not part of this. I want to be, and I strive to be, and this is more important than also my own resentment. And I also have to look beyond my own feelings here, but also dealing with just this. How do you deal with your own feelings, especially when they're ugly feelings? In political organizing of any kind is something that's like super neglected, and but it's something that's there, and I want to capture this, especially in my pieces. I have this, it's like a big thing.
Right. Yeah, and I can see how that sort of like off-putting separation comes through in this art piece we were just discussing, because it is very like, yeah, it is. I feel similar sort of like off-putting feelings looking at it, in terms of like, you know, this is a preserve for some elite that we are not a part of, or something like that. Okay, so the final piece to talk about for we basically two different final aesthetics to talk about here. Is on the top we have something that looks like sort of a going back to pop art again. It's like a PlayStation 1 game cover is kind of the aesthetic, I would say. like from a jewel case, right? We have the M-rated ESRB sticker at the top. Yeah, yeah. And then at the bottom we have these these two glitched out pieces. So yeah, can you talk about those a bit?
Yes. So the first one that you just mentioned, that's by Rain Mikes. The one who did, like, we had like amazing sessions, like late night Discord sessions with screen sharing, where we like basically did like live editing and tweaking of the promo poster, which came out very well. Like, Rain and I are like pretty good friends, I think, at this point. With this one, I basically was like, hey, this is completely your thing. Go off. Basically, this is completely your thing. And I was also, my first impression when I saw it was like, okay, what does this have to do with democratic economic planning? Like, I'm gonna be honest. And I think that's the first like reaction most people will have. And he actually wrote some text commentary about it, and also explicitly, like, basically he goes into, okay, what are the elements used in this, and how do they relate to the theme? And also it was very interesting, like also in a very abstract sense. It does make sense. So you have like the M-rated one, which is like overall, the whole thing is about courage, and courage we need to like stop postponing building making it super simple, like overcoming capitalism, like the courage we need, and also the danger and the excitement and all of the messiness that's going to be involved with that. Like the M-rated is kind of like, okay, this is not like, this is going to be real shit. This is going to be serious. And then also like it's going to be exciting. It's like adrenaline, like, because it's, oh my God, you are actually entering uncharted territory here. Like, you don't know how things will play out, but it's also like I mean, the whole like car thing is like, of course it's dangerous. Like, you can die when you crash and have an accident, but it's also, people do that to feel alive, to like have that, I don't know what will happen, but I need this to feel alive. And then the knights are also like this, okay, courage, like for him, the courage, like the, oh yeah. And I think also like he has the flowers in there. There is also a beauty, like a sublime beauty in that. That's like, yeah. And then he has a German saying, like also in OG German on it, which
Yeah,
is called,
with the Gothic script.
yes, des Teufels liebstes Möbelstück ist die lange Bank, which basically means, okay, stop postponing shit.
Okay.
Yes, that's what it means. Stop postponing shit. Yeah. That's kind of like how he like decrypted it most of the time. And yeah. And the two ones on the bottom, the glitch core ones, are by Poverty FL. And I actually stumbled across Poverty because he was the first person that I saw in like the Instagram, like this edit scene that I am in, whose art was like dedicatedly inspired by Cruelty Squad, by the video game. And you see like some elements popping up here, like the font of Cruelty Squad, but
usage,
others,
yep.
exactly,
And color
and
usage.
exactly, but I haven't seen this like especially in that edit scene. It's like dedicatedly Cruelty Squad style, and I was like, oh my God, fuck yeah, finally someone uses this. Like, I think I'm a big Cruelty Squad fan, and I think it's an amazing and amazingly interesting video game. Also, I would say like very much related to like schizo posting stuff. But also like for me, like you might ask us, oh, what is the game about? I think I also have like some Cruelty Squad reference. I not? Okay, I have like one tiny Cruelty Squad reference in one of my picks, but that's it. One texture. I don't know. But coming to the, let's not talk about Cruelty Squad too much. But coming to the glitch core ones, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say Cruelty Squad. The aesthetic of Cruelty Squad is very, very punk and very anti-aesthetic. It's meant to be kind of an assault on the senses in the way that it is aesthetically jarring, and it's not just that it doesn't fit together. It's also that everything that you get at a sensory level out of the game is very intense. So it's kind of like experimenting with aesthetic discomfort, right? Is it? I think is the approach that they took, and yeah, you can see that in this glitch core work, where there's like a lot of distorted perspectives and sort of like beyond chromatic aberration, but just like blown out colors, blurry images, things running into each other, different media being used, and it's like cohesive, but also like off-putting, right? I guess is how you would describe it.
I think it's like to a certain extent stylistically, it's somewhat representing of like a world that is overly complex and does assault our senses, and not in like the super stylized way that Cruelty Squad does, but in a more subtle and maybe therefore more devious way, and a world that makes very little sense, but in that not sense making is still coherent in that way, like maybe to interpret the aesthetic in some kind of way. Yeah.
Indeed. And yeah, like you were saying, it's sort of it all of that is like really playing with like representations of like mental illness, and isolation, social isolation, as like core like emotional themes, and aesthetic themes. So yeah, it's quite interesting as well. Okay, so yeah, you wanted to just read some selections of artist commentary or commentary on these pieces we've just discussed, right?
Yeah. I will read commentary that I wrote for Skyward by Choco. Also, like just so people get like an idea of, okay, these are not just like or Y2K styled pictures, and I just think that's interesting to look at or beautiful, but like on like the associations level, what I'll just read it basically. Yeah. So for everyone, also just like go to the YouTube video and look for the Skyward. Like in every text commentary, I basically indicated the title, and yeah.
Yeah, and I'll maybe see if I can somehow include the image of the whole exhibition I'm looking at here into the show notes too.
Maybe that would be great. Yeah. Okay. You spread your wings. They are not broken anymore. They healed. You can barely believe it. You've been so accustomed to a broken life, you mistook it for everything there possibly is. The old shit is not dragging you down anymore. Money, rent, food, job, insurance. such stupid mundane bullshit now that you think of it. That what was holding you back, dragging you down to lift off into the skies? Well, yes. The fact that that's even possible makes you sad. You shed a tear for your past self and everyone who didn't make it to this point. You know that you cannot let the grief weigh you down. This is too precious. You'll keep them in your heart. Everything will be redeemed. You'll lift off. So, yeah, not every text commentary that I wrote or that other people wrote is in that kind of style, is that poetic, but some of them are. Yeah.
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah, and I can see the connection to the art piece I'm looking at here. It's definitely a really interesting like connection to the sort of the promise of like a better world, and also the just the grief that comes with change and looking back at, well, I lived through this transition and I suffered because of it, right?
Yeah, that's more what I also meant with like, okay, it's super important for these emotions to be. I mean, I know it's not like you cannot integrate everything into political organizing. Like there must be a limit to things, but it's also like to completely exclude. Like we are still, to a somewhat extent, whole human beings, where some things that are in one area trigger things that are in another area, and that's just what human beings do. And just because like you cannot kind of like just cut off that one part, and when you enter that one area, and like it leaves you with like all of that collateral damage basically that's never addressed, and you're left alone like by your own to, yeah, now you have to deal with this, haha, we don't care. Yeah, it's for me the exhibition was kind of like my first attempt to even express that, because I've just never felt like I could express it anywhere. And yeah, so maybe some people like recognize something of themselves in here, or maybe get inspired to like, okay, hey, this is what I associate with this. And it's also like with the lifting into the skies and like your wings healed and stuff is, I mean, of course, it's like a very metaphorical, very abstract rendering of, hey, oh, a different economic system, a different society. But I mean, in the end, we all do this not because we like politics and economics so much. Like, no, like at least I do not. Like in the end, it's something entirely existential. Like I'm a person who wants to live and who wants to figure out what that can mean and make the most out of it. And in order to do that, there are these like obstacles, these things to engage with, and that's kind of a necessity. But most of the time in the discussions, in the discourses we have, like especially institutionally reproduced, they start to do like autopoiesis. Didn't pronounce that right, but you know what I mean. Autopoiesis, and put up these boundaries and start to revolving around themselves, losing all connection to everything else, and people start to disconnect from them. And that's how you basically get like political disengagement and resignation. And because people just don't connect with that stuff anymore, if you're not like, and that's how technocracy kind of emerges. And yeah, I don't have to answer how to reconnect this, but it's like, yeah, there is at least like a need to do somehow.
Yes, indeed, yeah. Okay, and there was one other you wanted to read.
Yeah, in my, like, we can first talk about my say, because it's in. I still have to decide which one of mine I want to read, to be
Okay.
honest.
All right.
But
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. So there are four pieces here on the in this final section that you produced. My impression of them overall is they have a very kind of like it's like a pictures folder you have on your hard drive.
exactly.
And it's like random sort of like clippings of the internet, but then also maybe like kind of like projects like little like memes you tried to make, or like small little like visual projects you did or something to share with a friend over time that have just kind of like accumulated in your pictures folder, right? And then if you took all of that and then sort of like tried to reproduce the aesthetic in individual pieces of art, that's kind of the feeling I get from this approach. And I would say to a lesser extent with the final one with the Hatsune Miku image, but the other three, they give me that kind of impression very strongly.
You know, it's actually kind of scary how like accurately you reverse engineered that. Like that's actually
Okay.
kind of this is like it's basically literally that. It's like stuff I come across the internet. Like probably 90% of that is just, or 95% of is just screenshotted, and it's just stuff where it's like monkey brain sees aesthetically interesting thing, neuron activated, screenshot, and coming back to it later because there was a reason why I screenshotted that at that moment, because I connected it with something. There was like some kind, yeah, as I said, like neuron activated, and
Well, and like you said with like interfaces, right? Like this is kind of an imagery that is recognizable because we interact with the pictures folder in whatever operating system we use, right? And so you see these kinds of things in that experience of, oh yeah, I remember I screenshot that for this reason or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, you know, I actually, so it's kind of small little tangent, but actually, I like it sounds weird, but I enjoy art so much more when I scroll through my Instagram and look at pictures there rather than when I go to like an exhibition or like something else. Like, uh, there are multiple reasons for that probably, but it's simply like also there is not this like pretend element. Like I feel like I can see a picture art more for what it is, in that, because it's like, okay, I'm like isolated on my phone, not in a group social situation, not in like, oh, how do you act in this situation? Like basically there's like so much social context to like the exhibition gallery setting, where I feel like the least important thing in that moment is the picture. Like it's like so much more about everything else, and I hate that. I despise that, and there is like a rawness to like the Instagram like scrolling, and I then at some point like came across like an Instagram photo of someone where I knew, oh, their art like in an Instagram format, and they had like printed it out and exhibited at a gallery. Like basically what I did with this one, like to be real. And I was like, I like that person's art relatively, like I found it interesting before. And as I saw that picture of like, oh, it's in a, I was like repulsed by it in that moment. And I was like, okay, if I ever do like a follow up project, like for funsies or something, you know, I will just print out the whole screenshot, leaving also like the Instagram like interface stuff, like the bars on top, and leaving them in the picture and put that on the wall. Like
You're, sure, 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 sure.
You have to fully like simulated experience. Like, oh, you're still on your phone even while you're not on your phone. You know,
Yes.
the safe space emulation.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I could see that absolutely. So we've kind of talked a little bit about what the aesthetic is and the creative process, but how did you associate these things with democratic economic planning? Like how did you connect those to, or these pieces to that?
Yeah. I think the one that's like most connected with it is the Miko piece, which is for everyone who's just listening and is committing the cardinal sin of not watching my video and looking at the pictures in the end. It's a blurred image of a crying Hatsune Miku that's like used in all kinds of memes, and basically. On top of her, like she's like in the background, on top of her, there are like visual, like abstract visual renderings of networks between nodes and connections and stuff. And I took that graphic with the nodes, and just copied it multiple times. And so it like gives like a nice shape and put that on top of it. And it's kind of like, of course, oh, too much complexity, Miku cries. And I named it literally me. I think .jpg or something.
Yeah.
Literally, and I can, you know what? Let's do that. I will read the text commentary because I think it like actually explains quite well how the connection is. Okay, it's also always filtered through like the very personal, I'm not like a disinterested observer of things. I'm an engaged subject in these things. That's always my stance, my POV with which I approach these things. So yeah. So let's say like it's not theory. Like let's say like theory describes the thing from the outside, and I describe the thing from the inside. But it might look different, but we're talking about the same thing because different things are relevant for these different actors. Okay. A picture of me trying to cope with complexity. It's all too much. How on earth could it be possible to control the complexity of something as huge as the economy? And then democratically too, lol. On the immediate level of experience, the uncontrollability of complexity and emergence seems to have a strong plausibility. Let's just think of any group situations of any kind. Somehow a certain dynamic always seems to develop almost automatically, which then determines the course of events. You may decide how you want to relate to this dynamic, but this is usually limited to affirmative absorption or rebellious rejection. None of this seems really attractive, let alone emancipatory. It seems as if the forces that significantly determine our lives always develop behind our backs or above our heads, and we are eternally at their mercy. No matter on which level and which area of life, be it private, small groups, or political economic. Why should it be different with the economy? And why at all give a fuck? In the end, one only cares about one's own life anyway. And what should change if the what should change there if the economic will not change anything at the direct social level? It will just be as alienated as before. Or would it? That's the text commentary about that, and yeah.
Yeah. That makes that makes a lot of sense. It's definitely like a relatable thought in terms of trying to do something like navigate, like engaging in an economic planning exercise to engage with all that complexity and to also to engage with, like you say, a dynamic, right? Like I think that's something that this emergent dynamic is something that we are all like concerned about thinking about such a thing, right? Because it's like you say, it can take on a life of its own and happen behind our backs, and it may not be what we want, right? but then we have to live with the dynamic. We can't engage in, just sort of like free choice about exactly what kind of system we live in.
Yeah, and I think like that's what I start with like on the personal experiential level. We all know this from like friend groups, from work groups, from small group situations, from like literally any kind of sort. Like it can be a two-person situation. And like it feels like that at every level where like something emerges, there's like this dynamic emerges which we may be able to influence to a certain extent, but it becomes like more and more alienated from our interests, our actions, and it seems to be like this alien force that has like this power over our lives and our destiny. And it's you can make your peace with it and say like, okay, hey, that's just how it is, and you start to like flow with it. Or like maybe that's like not the right formulation, but like that's like kind of like just giving up. Like I mean that's something
I mean the point about democratic planning is that like you don't just give up, right? You engage with it, like in a creative way.
Exactly, and I think like here I basically tried to trace the steps of I think like how a normal person who has never heard about this or has just heard about this idea thinks about this. Like what they know from their own personal life is like, okay, even on these like rather small scale levels, I can't even control the situation. These kind of like abstract social rules and dynamics start to emerge, and I just have to conform to them or face the consequences. And so that when you're starting to talk about something as huge and vast and depersonal as the economy, that it's not even an option to think about being able to like somewhat influence that in a somewhat directed way. Like they kind of like extrapolate from their own personal experience of emerging alienation and complexity to how would a bigger, even more way above our head system work. And I can understand the argument. I can understand where they're coming from and like the steps in their head. And I think I don't personally have a perfect answer for that person. And I'm, to be honest, to a certain, like, I mean, that's part of the whole engaging with the democratic economic planning discourse is trying to search and trying to come up with answers for that aren't just like cheap gotchas. Like on as my personal take, like I think notions of emancipation where like that come like from like a time where we still thought in like terms of like subject and object, where it's like the like classical notions of emancipation, like also from like Marxist time and stuff, where like humanity is not yet the agent of history, and history is kind of like something that happens to us. And once we do a communism, then we become the active agents of history. And what has been the object, humanity, of the subject, history of or capital, will become the subject. Like you have this like reversal of roles. And I mean, I can very much understand where that's coming from. And but I think like that's I mean I know we are both super influenced by like complexity theory, systems theory, etc., cybernetics, etc. And for me, it has been super helpful to like get out of like deadlocks that some kind of conceptual thinking are still, I think, still like carries with it, where because I think it's not the question of, oh, are you either an object or like do you have complete agency or do you have none? Like it's more a question of degrees. Like I wouldn't say, because I don't know, at least I'm agnostic or rather pessimistic about that we can become like basically fully self-transparent and basically humanity becoming God, basically.
Yes.
like being the mover of its own, like its own mover, so to say. And
The Promethean idea, right?
I mean, yeah, I think like that's like a super complex. I think the idea is like super attractive, and if it would be possible, I would probably love it. But I don't think it's like if you're serious about this stuff as a political project, I think you need to say like it's not either this or nothing. Like that's just childish, to be honest. Then you're not a serious, and you're not. This is not a. This is like theory to you, not like a serious political project. I think about it more in terms of okay, phase transitions and hegemony, where it's like okay, hey, yeah, there will be like this point of alienation and these like social rules and dynamics that we don't like control immediately. Or like that we also don't like we don't recognize our agency in them. They are fundamentally alienated to a certain extent, but there might come historical points or like phase transitions where one kind of a hegemony for a multiplicity of reasons is breaking down, becoming fragile and stuff. And then you can fight for a new hegemony, a new kind of alienated, alienated set of systems and dynamics, but which is in the way it like organizes this alienation is less alienating, so to say. So like stuff like the details matter, like questions of like what I mentioned in like the text commentary to Skyward. If you have to worry like your entire life basically about like rent, insurance, money, etc., job, or if you don't have to do that, that makes a huge difference. And I think that's something like not having to worry about that is something that's like very imaginable, very realistic. And even in a set of social rule, like it still might be alienating, but like, hey, having some kind of democratic input into the economy, being somehow able to like give, like to influence it, like that's what I would call like create, like it's not full emancipation where we become God, but it's like being able to have more of an influence over what happens to us. That's kind of like how I try to think about these things. Yeah.
Sure. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that I agree with you, like in the sense that it's about imagining sites where we could be less alienated and striving to realize those because yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, if you're talking about like total non-alienation, then it's just like, you know, human instrumentality from Evangelion, right? Like that it becomes something quite metaphysical and bizarre. But if we can, if we can see these sort of like liberatory desires that are connected to specific sites, then we can start to think in a more nuanced way about what it is we really want when we talk about de-alienation or moving past that.
You know, it's super funny that you mentioned Evangelion and Human Instrumentality Project, because I have like a very personal connection to that. Like I watched it when I was 17 and haven't watched it ever since. But I think like the funny thing is also that you like formulated like this. I think watching it with 17 in like high puberty phase for me, like fucked my head up in a certain sense because like I have huge problems with like dealing with alienation. There is this inherent desire of like overcoming alienation and like the separatedness to someone else. And I think I have a very like when I was 17, like this anime did something to my brain where the idea of like where the Human Instrumentality Project idea of like dissolving all separation between you and the other basically has become like the ultimate idea to strive for in my head and emotionally. And I still struggle to this day, like 9 years later, with this. And maybe I need to rewatch it because and maybe this will, yeah, but it's funny that you said this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's kind of it's a very good example of taking that drive to its extreme, right? And then for yeah, the original series of Evangelion, there's a sort of happy resolution to it by getting through the alienation. But then, I guess you get to sort of like more mature reckonings of that problem, right? Where you realize, like, yeah, you can, as you said, sort of have alienation in a way, but it's less so, or it's somehow reconciled, and that is something that's inherently much more livable than total separation, or the kind of impossibility of total or total homogenization of everything. Yeah.
And this is perfect. It ties back to like it ties perfectly back to what I said earlier, because here, like, we are discussing like abstract notions of emancipation and what could having a democratic economy actually mean? How would that, like, what would be like the personal, like, how would it feel to live in such a society? I think that's like a fundamental idea that we need to like give answers to, or like try to give answers to, because that's what people will ask. How will this be relevant for me? They don't care about models or some other bullshit like that. That's just meaningless. Uh, yeah, and but like the question of, okay, how much of alienation can you get rid of? And we all, like, alienation is at once like an abstract philosophical concept, but at the same time it's something like that we can experience, something like a feeling, and that makes it super interesting. And then questions of like, okay, like almost Kantian questions of like, okay, what life can I possibly live? But like maybe not as Kantian in like the super abstract sense, but like, okay, wait, what the question that I mentioned earlier from like this very existential human perspective. I'm a human living today. What does that mean? What kind of life can I possibly live in our world today, given the circumstances that are given to me? And what, like, does it like, and question, does it make sense to like strive for total de-alienation or not? Like, I think these like super existential human questions, which are also not just philosophical, but deeply emotionally tied, because like when you ask yourself, you are in a relationship, you are like, I don't know, you think about your job, your life, or whatever, and you think, what do I want to do with my life? Am I happy this way? Is this what I want? These kinds of questions pop up. They are deeply important to you. And I think, and this is where, what would it mean to live in a democratic, what can the democratic economy offer you, is maybe a different answer to this. Like, and that's maybe like the final, like the tying it all together, basically. Like, that is the fundamental question. Like, and yeah, we all have to grapple with these questions. And that's also what I would say, like, for someone who visited the exhibition and who was not familiar with the idea, or has not, like, why does this matter to me? Where is the connection to my own life? I couldn't reproduce it as perfectly as we have just right now, but basically these kinds of thoughts this is why this is important to you, because it is.
Yeah, because the sort of the fundamental connection you get in Marx between sort of sociological theory and lived experience is that this idea that material conditions shape subjective experiences, right? And so there's kind of a notion there that, like, yeah, in different conditions we can have very different subjectivities, and that you know, the promise of communism is that we can have ultimately a different subjective experience of the world, because we live in different conditions, and there's something like profoundly emancipatory there, not just something that is emancipatory in terms of, like, sort of, I guess you could say, like, game theory notions of agency, right? Or notions of, like, purchasing power or something like that.
Yeah, no, the whole frame changes, and that's the point. The whole frame and the whole, like, horizon of option changes. And I think you could even say, like, everyone who has traveled a bit more and spent, like, a little bit more time in different place of the world, like, sadly I haven't much, but, like, they will. I mean, you spend a lot of time in Japan, and, like, you immediately, okay, something's different here. And, like, it's not just something we have to, like, say, oh, in the future there will be different no, different subjects are already here, so to say. And like, the whole like, different histories, different material conditions, like, everything wrapped up. And I feel like I would love to travel much more and have, like, widen my horizons in that regard. And I think it's probably, like, a good thing to do so also. But it's also, like, I'm, for example, like, super jealous and also resenting people who do have the financial means to do so, who, like, grew up with the notion, or, like, grew up with the notion and, like, the self-confidence that they can do that. And it's like this weird mishmash which of, like, also emotions of, like, something that in itself is good, but that also is used to, or, like, is, like, a means to reproduce social inequality. And it's, like, such a fucked up mishmash. And like, it's just like, okay, so am I supposed to like that thing now because it's in itself good, or am I supposed to hate that thing now because it's, like, used to like, to draw these, like, social boundaries between us? And, like, so what the hell am I supposed to do here? And I'm very, very, like, confronted with that kind of questions also a lot when it comes to art. And I'm struggling a lot with, like, okay, how to behave towards these things. And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think those are the sort of, like, the sort of things that matter a lot when we think about the practicalities of democratic economic planning. Because, like, for example, as you say, like, access to consumer goods and purchasing decisions and experiences that are commodified is used for, like, it is a way for social stratification to happen subjectively as well as objectively. And if you are existing in a society where people have equal access to the things that they need and want, then you have to have, this reckoning with, like, yeah, your desires, but also your resentments, in a way that capitalism renders simpler, right? Because it basically simplifies this question by saying, if you come from this class background, these are the kinds of experiences you do and should want in your life, right? So everything is a class signifier, and also there are, very concerted efforts through like marketing and product development and everything to produce lifestyles for different class positions so that the social world becomes intelligible as a ranking. And that is, something that I know that that Hayek praised about capitalism was that it creates this like stratified notion of taste and lifestyle according to who's at the top versus who's at the bottom, and the people at the top lead taste. And he thought that was like rational. So I don't think so, but I understand what is being said there in terms of you're not opening everything up and then reckoning with people's feelings. Instead, it's like you're channeling people's feelings into very specific categories, and there is a kind of like organizational effort that happens there that makes the social world in a way like simpler. It attenuates the variety. And if we talk about like democratic economic planning, then we're talking about like, breaking open those rigid categories and negotiating amongst each other as equals. What do we actually desire? What do we actually want? And that is, in a way, a kind of, it's an exciting prospect, but it's also a kind of a frightening prospect, because it means like, getting at the core of what you want as opposed to just like keeping up with the Joneses, right? That's, I mean, look at how many people, look at how much of like YouTube is about like influencing and selling lifestyles, right? Like it is a massive enterprise in the context of like a massive consumer economy, and you need to think about something different for that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think you're very, very right when you say like, okay, like a democratic economy would be like breaking up those rigid categories, and it would be also frightening and like disorienting, and maybe also what I'm trying to capture a little bit with like the kind of like the pain from the past, from like what happens if people who used to be in very different social like circles and stratas now encounter each other on a level playing field, because there is resentment, there is like fear, you don't know how to treat each other, and which means, okay, this is going to be super messy and much more complex. Actually, it's not, we're all gonna hold hands and sing kumbaya like and harmony and utopia. It's going to be very messy and much more complexity, and but also at the same time, you might say that makes it also futuristic. That like, okay, we might be able to afford more of that complexity, and but it also doesn't mean now like everything can go unchanneled. Like we'll need to find new of these like variety attenuation, complexity reduction mechanisms and forms, and that's some of that stuff we will need to like try out like upfront. Some of that stuff will emerge in the process. I mean, those are very interesting and exciting questions. I mean, maybe one of the great kind of like avant-garde fields in that regard is like democratic work environments. Like to a certain extent, co-ops. Of course, co-ops are like still part of like a capitalist market structure and subject to competition and everything. But at least like, okay, democratic governance of like an organization. Like you also see that when you're part of a union or any kind of other like really, okay, you have bottom up, be it through voting or some other mechanism, democratic determination mechanism, it feels completely different. You have a completely different relation to the people around you and to the organization itself. And that doesn't mean, this is paradise. It also means like, fuck, you don't know what you are supposed to do because it's super alien to you. Like, and you have to learn it. That's also a thing. And but like those are environments where you can start to like train these like skill sets, like learning how to deal and cope with that complexity. And really, maybe like culturally, we are probably not super ready for that kind of complexity, but at least like in like limited environments, like for example workplaces, like in like organizational frames where it might be easier to introduce and test mechanisms like this rather than okay on a society-wide cultural scale. And maybe if we start to like that's also the thing, like with what I have in the Miku piece is like, oh well, but if we just change the economy, what is the like, and it doesn't change anything about like the social realm, like in my immediate environment, in my immediate encounters, like what is it even good for? Like why should I give a shit about it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember my advisor mentioning, like, when he my old advisor mentioning Andrew Feenberg mentioning when he talked to Marcuse about the German Revolution and saying, you know, oh well, they did everything democratically and then they voted in all the same people. You know, that's the fear, right? Is you don't want that. Yeah.
But like what I mean is like, okay, maybe it's like because then like the like changing the economy is like something that's like more tangible in terms of like it has to do with institutions and organizations and like stuff where there are rules that you can also change, which are much like which is much more difficult in like culture and a general like kind of like the like those like intangible social rules and like behavioral dynamics. And but okay, what if let's say like okay, every workplace works different and like works democratic, and then like oh, you all have like different like somewhat equal access to goods and like experiences and stuff, and oh, you don't also have to worry about all of the stuff like insurance, money, rent, etc., food, etc. You know, even if those are like very like formal things, it would transform the entire social edifice. It would change everything, and you would lead a completely different life. And I cannot predict what kind of life, but I don't know how it will feel. But like this changing the economy will change everything. Like that's the yeah. It may not do away with alienation completely, but yeah.
Well, and I think that's a pretty good place to leave the conversation. I think it's like, you know, we sort of have all of these different aesthetic provocations here, and we've kind of like talked through the different dimensions of how they are connected to life. And, you know, it's kind of like we have aesthetic possibilities in front of us in this very sort of like eclectic, kind of like anarchic collection here. And, you know, it's like, okay, given the concerns we have, given the desires and the fears and everything we have, like how can we articulate this idea of democratic economic planning to people in an aesthetic or multiple aesthetics that rhyme with each other?
Yeah, as like a last thing also, I think like also posing the question of like, oh, we have to now find the new aesthetic is also like reductive. Like it's always a question. To a certain extent, you will always have a marketing dimension to it, where you have to basically tailor your message and your aesthetic to like different groups, which will respond differently to different aesthetics. That's just how communication works nowadays. But also because you still have like a public sphere and not everything is like filtered through personal algorithms. You will also still have like an element of somewhat universality in it, and and the tension of like, okay, make it like somewhat universal and abstract, but also like personal and emotional, or like where are boundaries there? all of that's how much personal like influence can there be. Like, this is very personally influenced by me. Someone who might do this differently might have done a completely different exhibition, something that's like much more in line maybe with more traditional leftist aesthetics, which, I'm being quite friendly, I find very boring. And but yeah, all of these are open questions, and I encourage everyone who found this interesting and maybe like had like, oh, holy shit, what they just said made like I related to that. You might want to start thinking about these questions. Also, if you're interested in like this topic, you can hit me up anytime on my social media, which is at Grate, which is GRAET 97, either on Instagram or on Twitter. On Instagram, you will also find other works of mine, like here, just like, yeah, just some of it. And I'm also already talking with people about like a possible follow-up event, because like there was quite good responses to this, and I'm starting to make connections with people, trying to make this a little bigger, also expand probably into connections of like, hey, games, simulations, futures research, design stuff, etc., etc. Let's see, maybe also like music stuff. Duamur, as I said, is also a producer, has music connections, and then you can also link it to experiential future stuff and all kinds of stuff. So if you're interested in this, if you have ideas for this, if you have connections, hit me up. I'm super down to talk, to make connections, and to make something follow up happening. Because in the end, this is about like spreading ideas and making this like an ongoing thing, rather than just like, oh, I did this exhibition once and that was fun, but then never again. Yeah, that's kind of like the whole shtick of it. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being on the show. And yeah, if you are interested, please follow up. And I'll leave the outro bits to June as usual.
Oh, we can also thanks again, but you can also like tag the in the show notes my socials.
Oh yes,
for contact for people. And thanks so much for having me on, and this amazing, like really amazing conversation. Like, appreciate it a lot. Evangelion reference. I just say.
I always come back to that because it's such a good example.
I will think about that a lot, actually. Like, thanks for hitting the nail on the head with that one.
Oh, good.
Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit. While you wait for the next episode, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook and all the podcast apps. If you'd like to support the show, get access to our community Discord, and help keep the lights on, then go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and give us a couple of bucks a month. Every contribution is greatly appreciated. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as Swampside Chats, From Alpha to Omega, Jumpsuit Utopia, and Mortal Science. They're excellent shows and excellent folks. As always, thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope you'll join us again next time.